So I just had a session with Diane, and if I'm incoherent, you can blame her. Because I may be a little too much into my body, so we'll see how much of the upper chakras are functioning at this point. Okay, so we've been talking about the possibility of mindfulness revolution. And I've made a few points. Let's just review. We have some guests tonight coming in media res, so to speak. So I like to think about mindfulness from what might be described as a unified point of view, a widely encompassing point of view. I think it is possible to have, through careful analysis of the dimensions involved, it's possible to understand certain underlying commonalities, not just for the Southeast Asian Buddhist practice, which is where current mindfulness sort of historically came from, but more broadly all of Buddhist practice, and more broadly still all of contemplative practice all around the world. Any contemplative practice, East or West, could be nicely analyzed in terms of the degree to which, the way in which three core skills are talked about, cultivated, and applied. So the three core skills are concentration, sensory clarity, and equanimity. You can think about concentration as the ability to focus on what you deem relevant at a given time. What's important about that way of describing concentration is not so much what I said, but what I didn't say. I did not imply that concentration is necessarily limiting the spatial scope of your focus. I did not imply that concentration necessarily was holding just one thing for a long duration. Concentration could be expansive. It can cover a large domain. Yes, it could be spatially contractive also. And those are actually subdimensions of the concentration skill, how broad or narrow you focus. Concentration can be momentary. You can make break, make break, make break, make break. Taste momentary high concentration on a variety of objects. But you can also have sort of what people often think about when they hear the word concentration, which is holding just one thing in attention for an arbitrary duration of time. Like you can hold the sensation at the tip of your nostril for 4 hours without any wavering whatsoever. Now, that ability to hold just one thing for an extended duration of time, that certainly is a subdimension of the concentration skill. However, the ability to make break, and have what is called Kanika Samadhi, or momentary high concentration, that's also very important, especially if you want to maintain mindfulness, a deep state of mindfulness while you're engaging in daily life. You're driving a car, you're having a conversation. Eventually, we want you to experience being very, very deep while you're moving around, and to get the maximum meditation mileage out of each moment of daily life, to monasticize your life, as we were talking about in the group process. For that, understanding the dimension of concentration skill, which is momentary high concentration, but consciously tasted. As I say, it's technically called Kanika Samadhi in the Pali language. So, speaking of concentration as the ability to attend to what you deem relevant, Not saying it has to be this thing or that thing. It has to be your breath or your body, not limiting it by its range, and not limiting by saying, well, it has to be something small, it could be something large. Not limiting the concept of concentration to, well, it has to be a long duration on just one thing. It could be momentary on a variety of sensory targets as they present themselves. So, as I say, the way I like to talk about concentration, what's important is not just what I say, but what I don't say, because there is a tendency to assume that concentration means hold a small thing for a long period of time. And yes, indeed, that represents two dimensions of the skill, but there are other facets to it. Concentration is to focus on what you deem relevant. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, I don't want to learn to concentrate because I need to let my attention freely float in order to be creative and make associations. Well, if that's what's relevant to the moment, then your ability to do that will be enhanced by concentration. Concentration will not get in the way of that intuitive flux. In fact, it will enhance it. You'll focus just on the place in consciousness that makes those connections for you, because that's what's relevant to that moment. So concentration power, sensory clarity has the second aspect. It has two subdimensions, basically. You know, I've talked about it in the group process. Resolution, the ability to upgrade the discrimination or bandwidth within the sensory circuits themselves. That's the resolution. And then detection. Subtle is significant. The ability to detect subtle sensory events that are normally subliminal is hugely important on this path. So concentration power, resolution, and detection skills, particularly the ability to detect the very instant when a new sensory event arises, and the very instant when an old sensory event passes. Because where things come from and where they go to are the same place. And we've talked a little bit about the primordial great perfection. Well, that's what precedes and follows each ordinary inner and outer sensory experience. So the ability to detect what happens at the very instant of the arising of any sensory experience, and the ability to detect what happens as it's passing, is the ability to briefly be vectorially directed towards something that is beyond sensory experience, something that is beyond the embedding of time and space. Okay, so sensory clarity. Equanimity, originally equanimity as a term from the Latin, aequo anima, literally means a balanced state. And originally it meant sort of being unmoved and unexpressive. But that's not at all what it means as a technical term to describe the dimensions of mindful awareness, not at all. It's balanced in a different sense. Balanced in the sense of not pushing on experience that's trying to arise, so not suppressing the arisings, and not inappropriately holding sensory experience that's about to pass. So it's basically training the sensory circuits into training away their subtle tendencies to interfere with themselves. it's analogous to reducing friction in a mechanical system. That's at least the way I think about it. We cultivate these, so I said that I like to think of mindfulness. So the modern mindful movement, in my own mind, the phrase that I like to use is that it's contemplative-based psycho-spiritual growth working in concert with science. So a two-way street. Science will help us understand it in a way that we could never have understood it before. Even the great masters of the past didn't know even basic neuroscience. So they could only give a first-person report, and they did so brilliantly, but with the current ways to objectively think about the biophysical basis of our experience and so forth, that's going to give us now an incredible advantage to innovate, to understand at deeper levels what's involved in these psychologically and spiritually significant growth that humans go through when they do this practice. So working in concert, meaning we look to science to improve and deepen our understanding of what's going on. But also, the mindfulness practice will improve the scientists as humans and as professionals. And so you get a positive feedback loop going that could be very impactful in the next century or so. I'm a big picture guy, so I look to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Toynbee, who is a very famous historian, made an extraordinary statement. He said that when all is said and done, it is possible, he didn't say this would happen, but he said it is possible that big picture-wise, in retrospect, 3 or 4 centuries from now, the single most important event of the 20th century will be the discovery on the part of the West of Buddhism. That is a direct quote from Toynbee. Not that the Buddhist, not that I think the Western world is going to adopt the Buddhist religion, but there are certain discoveries that the Buddha made that I think will absolutely pass the test of time and turn out to be very important for the whole human race. So that's sort of the basic paradigm that I presented to you. And then I said, okay, that's the modern mindfulness movement, but how about, mindfulness itself? How do we think about that? So I think about it as the systematic cultivation and broad application of those core skills. Mindful awareness being defined as concentration power, sensory clarity, and equanimity working together. So broad application, reducing suffering, elevate fulfillment, understanding oneself at all levels, increasing skillful actions, and ultimately, the ultimate application is in discovering a spirit where you want to serve from love. That in Buddhism we call the bodhicitta. So we talked yesterday about the dimension of application, which is understanding yourself at all levels. And just to make things sort of give some organization to things, I said we might consider 4 aspects of that. So one aspect would be more surface, which is to understand your own personality. How do these skills relate to understanding your own personality? Well, as you're sitting and practicing, you've all noticed this, sometimes insights will arise spontaneously that are personal insights. You sort of understand yourself. And that's nice, and that's the result of observing yourself in a mindful state. However, there may be aspects of understanding your own personality that don't just percolate up spontaneously in your practice. You may have to go to a professional, a counselor, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, to address certain aspects of personality if they don't get taken care of automatically by the practice. And the way you'll know that the practice hasn't taken care of it is you've been practicing for 20 or 30 years and people tell you you're still an asshole. So clearly something's, you know through feedback, okay? You know through, things not working out. It's like, well, I've learned to transcend, and it doesn't bother me that, stuff is not working out because of my behavior, but actually it should sort of bother you. If the practice can't address it, then, well, there are specialists who work at the personal level. That's what they're trained to do. So the practice may address understanding yourself at the personal level. Maybe it's all you need, or maybe you need something else. So then there's what might be called the depths or the subconscious. So certain forms of therapy claim to address that. In fact, your classical therapies, so they don't call it depth psychology for nothing, Freudian, Jungian, and so forth, claim that they get down to that level, whereas other forms of therapy might not. I'm not going to get involved in whose claims are valid, but it's just something to know about. Okay, there are the depths. Part of the depths are personal, but some of them, Jungians would claim that there's a collective unconscious, that there's things deep down there that are sort of universal. So, you may come in direct contact with those depths as the result of mindfulness practice. You will definitely come indirectly in contact with them. But once again, there are practices that are not strictly part of mindfulness that are designed to sort of touch those levels. First of all, depth psychology. But secondly, shamanism. Our ancient ancestors all over the world, in the tribal forms of culture, would contact the spirit world. One nice way to get in contact with that, if you're interested, is to do, say, Native American ceremonies and things like that. Now, there's more to the Native American path than that, because of the nature, in order to find the spirit world, typically you do shamanic ordeals. You expose yourself to hot here, like sweat lodge or sun dance. In Japan, you expose yourself to cold. You have to chant mantras squatting under a waterfall in winter for hours on end. And so all around the world, shamanism entails physical sacrifices. And those sacrifices are done within a ritual context, which of course encourages a concentrated state and encourages a state of equanimity. So although they may not systematically deconstruct their personhood, just doing those ceremonies in order to contact the spirit world would tend to have the effect of taking people into the deepest level, which is the source, which is that formless doing that I talked about a few minutes ago, what precedes each sensory and motor arising and what follows each sensory and motor arising is something beyond form. And so there's the world of spirits, which is the subconscious, and then there is the Great Spirit, or the Dharmakaya, we would call it in Buddhism, the formless absolute rest and absolute activity that is at the source of each moment of perception and expression for us. So the result of attempts to contact the spirit world through what was apparently natural to all of our ancestors all over the world, which is you fast, you expose yourself to heat, expose yourself to cold, you go without water, you allow yourself to be pierced or scarified, or other such things that forces you into the spirit realm. That's true, but it also forces you into a state of high concentration and equanimity, which would then likely lead you to a no self or an experience of touching something that is beyond the spirits, which could be called the Great Spirit. But as I say in Buddhism, we call it the Dharmakaya. Means the body of the Absolute. And then the realm of spirits is called the Sambhogakaya, which is the realm of glorious forms. And then the surface is called the Nirmanakaya, the conventional experience. So Native American specifically and shamanic broadly can make a nice complement to the mindfulness practice because it can take you to the experience of the very deepest level that we'll talk about a little more in a minute. But it also, if you're interested in contacting the, quote, spirit world, well, the archetypes, the realm of archetypes, well, that's another specialist that can supplement the mindfulness practice. So, okay, understand the surface individual personality, either through the practice, just intrinsically, or maybe go to a specialist. Understand the subconscious, either just through the practice or maybe go to a specialist. What is another aspect is what I started to talk about yesterday, which is to understand yourself as a sensory system. So the way that I like to do that, it can be done in various ways, but my favorite way is to work with mental image, mental talk, and body emotion. The reason I like to work with those three sensory elements is that they, as far as I can tell from introspection, they form a natural system. And I believe that we'll be able to use neuroscience to ferret out those connections. In fact, that's sort of the main goal of my, my projects at Harvard Medical School, are to tease out that inner system and see if we can find the neural correlates of it as a system. So, in any event, the mental image, mental talk, and body emotion, see in, hear in, inner seeing, inner hearing, and the innermost part of our body experience, which is the emotional body, the limbic system. That they work together. There's four basic things that happen. They all involve the word action. So first of all, there is interaction. Mental image can trigger mental talk. Mental talk can trigger mental image. Mental image can trigger body emotion. Body emotion can build until it turns into an image. Or body emotion can trigger mental talk. Or the whole thing can activate simultaneously, and they're all sort of triggering each other. So you can actually watch how the flow of interaction occurs within that system, and you can unblock that flow. So that's the interactivity of those elements. And then there's the reactivity of those elements. External sights, external sounds, physical touches arise, and then the inner system reacts to those sometimes. And when you have an arising of touch, sight, sound, and an arising of image, talk, and body emotion at the same time, that creates the sense of the world over here and me over here as perceiver. So what would happen if there was just touch, sight, sound, and no inner reactivity at all? Well, you can actually see what would happen by observing the system. You observe the system, and sometimes it doesn't react. It simply is inactive. And there's no sense of observer, no sense of an eye that's hearing or seeing. There's just seeing, just hearing, and you are that. And the barrier between inside and outside disappears, which makes it rather easy, rather natural to have that sense of wanting to serve from love, because it seems like not just every person, but every thing that you look at, you inhabit. So you are it. So sometimes that system reacts, and sometimes that system is inactive. And the other thing that inner system does is it goes proactive. That's my own private language. Proactive means it disengages from the touch, sight, sound world, and it goes off and begins to spin memory, plan, fantasy. In neuroscience, that's called the default network, okay? It has a distinctive signature. So it's off and it's problem solving, or it's worrying, or it's fantasizing out of fear, or fantasizing out of desire to entertain, etc., etc. It's like a home entertainment system. It just goes off on its own. So you can monitor you can understand yourself as a sensory system by observing this. So why is that useful? Well, first of all, it can hugely reduce suffering without necessarily changing the content of your sensory experience. Because when those elements tangle in unconsciousness and coagulate due to lack of equanimity, that vastly increases the suffering associated with unpleasant content. And that vastly reduces the fulfillment that is potentially there when it's a pleasant content. So just by bringing untangling, which is your clarity piece, and unblocking, which is your equanimity piece, by bringing those qualities to that inner system, you achieve two of the dimensions of happiness that I talk about: reduction of suffering, elevation of fulfillment. But it's much more than that. Working with that system is related to understanding yourself, because you see, oh yeah, this is how it actually arises, this I amness. It's also related to improving behavior, because behaviors are preceded by will. If I have an anger issue, or if I have a substance abuse issue, or a procrastination issue, that will to that experience of anger, or the will to abuse a substance, or a will that says, I don't want to do such and such even though I know I should, that arises within that inner system. And so your ability to have equanimity with that, which will break the identification with the negative urges. And that is not all that's involved in behavior change, but that certainly is an important component. If you can stay, if you're in recovery and you're jonesing for whatever it is, a cigarette or a drink or whatever, well, that's going to come up in that system. And if you can track it, unblock it, not suppress the experience of the desire, but also not lock onto it. If you can stay with it and just watch it expand and contract for however long it takes, well, it'll break up. The urge will break up, and that will help you make the behavior change. Gives you a very systematic way to go about that aspect of behavior change. Now, in the morning group process, we talked about the fact that there's more to behavior change than just deconstructing undesirable desires. But that is part of it. So it turns out that working with this inner system is germane to certain aspects of objective positive behavior change. It's also related to the love and service piece, because once you see where that system arises from, you realize that everyone arises from that same place. And so that's another way that you're always looking at yourself, basically. So untangling those strands is important in reducing subjective suffering. But it's also important in gaining insight. So this is where we left off in the talk yesterday. Buddhism would say that if you carefully observe the components that create the impression I amness, you'll see that there are only those components, and there actually is no thing inside you called a self. Now, First of all, that's counterintuitive because it seems to just about everyone that there is a thing inside me called a self. So why are you trying to tell me there isn't? And the other thing is, even if it's true, who wants it? What's the payoff for seeing that there's no thing inside you called a self? Well, let me suggest to you that there are the experience that in Buddhism is described as seeing that there's no thing inside you called a self, is one facet on the jewel of enlightenment. The jewel of enlightenment has a lot of sides to it. That's an important side. And anyone that has had these experiences will appreciate why someone would get all excited about pointing out to you that there is no thing inside you called a self. However, that is just one facet of the experience. And there are other ways that that experience can be described. For example, it's an experience of a connection to all things. It's an experience of the boundary between inside and outside going away, or more accurately, an experience that lets you realize that the boundary was never there to begin with. It's another way to put it. You could say no self, or you could say it allows you to have an elastic self, an elastic identity, that it can expand and contract. It can be the normal size, which is the normal you, or it can reach out and encompass the larger world that you normally don't think of as you. It can reach out and sort of encompass a person that's in front of you, or the flower that's in front of you. So your identity gets about this big, okay? And it can shrink down and be about this big. But it can get a lot bigger. It's elastic. It can reach out to the ends of the imagined universe. So any world systems that you would imagine, you embrace them. But it can also shrink down. It can shrink down to inhabit the center of every atom. I'm speaking metaphorically here. So it has been said that poets can see in the dark. I think it was Lorca that said that. The South American writer, but I could be wrong, but I think he said poets could see in the dark. He's the one that said it. Case in point is Rainer Maria Rilke, R-I-L-K-E, one of the most amazing poets of all time. I don't know what kind of ether he pulled his poetry from. I mean, he lived 100 years ago, right? Where did he pull that from to be able to say the things he says? It's inexplicable. Specifically, what he had to say 100 years ago, when Europe was just starting to discover Buddhism. I mean, just starting. Knowledge of Buddhism was rudimentary in Europe in his time. He absolutely nailed the essence of the Buddha's enlightenment as it would be interpreted in the Japanese Zen tradition, without, as far as I know, any direct contact with the Japanese Zen tradition, and with rather little contact with anything about Buddhism. How did he do it? I don't know. But I have a translation of his poem that I made myself from German on my website, Buddha in der Gloria, the Buddha in Glory. Mitte aller Mitten, Kern der Kerne, Mandel, die sich einschließt und versüßt. Dieses alles bis an alle Sterne ist dein Fruchtfleisch. Sei gegrüßt. Center of all centers, core of cores, almond that enclosed itself to sweeten. All of this to the furthest stars is your fruit flesh. Hear my greeting. He is congratulating the Buddha on the moment of his enlightenment, the morning after Buddha did yaza, an all-night sit, was enlightened in the morning when he saw the morning star, Venus. How did he get it? How did he know about expansion and contraction? And how to link that to the Buddha? God, can I remember the rest of it? Sie, du fühlst wie nicht mehr anhängt. Im Unendlichen ist deine Schale und dort steht der starke Saft und Tränen. Und von außen hilft ihm ein Gestrahler, denn ganz oben werden deine Sonnen voll und glühend umgedreht. Doch in dir ist schon begonnen, was die Sonnen übersteht. I can't believe I remember that. See, you feel nothing more upon you clinging. Your shell is opened wide without a bound. The ripe sap endlessly streaming within you, the ripened sap. Dort steht der Saft und dreht. Und von außen, and from outside, you were helped by a star. That's the seeing of the Venus, the morning star. Und von außen hilft ihm ein Gestrahler. Denn ganz oben werden deine Sonnen. Then all around you orbited your stars. Your voll und glühend umgedreht. They all around you orbited, shining, richly shining. Doch in dir ist schon begonnen, was die Sonnen übersteht. But in you has, but that which will outlive the stars in you has now begun. That's the poem that Rilke wrote to describe the Buddha's enlightenment, with almost no knowledge of Buddhism. I repeat, what ether did he access to pull that out of? Okay, so center of all center, core of cores, all of this to the farthest stars. It's an elastic identity. You could also call it a no-self. Okay, so how does that come about? Well, early Buddhism would say when you untangle the strands, then the somethingness of self is seen as an illusion. And where we left off in the talk last night was I gave the traditional metaphor for that. The Chariot Metaphor from this great scripture called The Questions of King Menandros. King Melinda, but King Menandros. He was Greek, a Westerner, talking to a Arhat. way, way, way back. And the dialogue is recorded. So the Arhat Nagasena, quoting a Buddhist nun named Vajira, said, well, it's when you dissect a chariot, there's just the parts. There's no thing called a chariot. So when you dissect I amness, there's just rupa, vedana, sanjñā, samskara, vijñāna. There's just matter, feeling, thought, subliminal habit forces, and consciousness. And no self. There's just those elements and there's no self. In another place in Buddhist literature, it's not quite the whole picture of self, but it's self in terms of identifying with the body, saying, I am body. There's this extraordinary passage where the Buddha says, just as a skillful butcher would carve up a steer, and at some point the perception steer goes away and the perception meat arises. So in the same way, the skillful meditator deconstructs the body into earth, water, air, and fire, 4 elements, and the perception I am a body disappears, and the perception there are just these elements arises. So we see in early Buddhism that the notion of untangling strands in order to eliminate an emergent property was not just applied to the 5 aggregates. It was also applied to the perception of the physicality of the body, and the deconstructive strands were the primitive chemistry of that time. But, it sort of works, and it actually does work. You can do it. Maybe just for the fun of it, one of these days I'll give a guide. I've actually done this with people. I've done the old-fashioned 4-element deconstruction of somethingness of your body. You can totally do it, okay? Even though we know that as far as physics goes, it's a pretty primitive view of physics, but it still works, okay? What you do is, because it's based on experience, right? They state it as though it's based on objective science, but it's based on sensory experience. So you tune into your body, and you find all the bones and the hard parts, okay? Well, that's the earth element, right? So you tune into those and get a really good sense of that. And then you get a sense of anything that's sort of airy, like your breath or, other flatulence or things like that. And then you get the circulation of the watery parts, okay? And then you get you can feel warmth in different parts. And you just tune into the putative characteristics of the 4 elements, and you sort of get those sensory strands all separated out, and sure enough, you start to experience there's just the 4 elements, there's not a thing called a body here. So the method of divide and conquer is not limited to the 5 aggregates, and in fact, I vastly prefer the 3 inner elements. Occam's razor, okay? If 3 will do the trick, why not have 3 instead of 4 or 5, etc., etc. Okay, so I pointed out that untangling mental image, mental talk, and body emotion is, my friends at Google would say it's a non-trivial issue, okay? I love this jargon. Instead of saying significant or hard, they say non-trivial. So this is non-trivial. because each of these systems is scaled. If you look into image space, there's the surface images, but those trigger subtle association images. And each of those subtle associations triggers a whole bunch of subtler associations. The bulk of all of this is below the threshold of ordinary awareness, but with your detection skills and your concentration skills, you can actually detect it. Not in terms of the content. The content is too fugacious and parallel. Fugacious means it just passes too quickly, and it's massively parallel. But you can detect the aggregate, the state, like the state variable. You can sort of take the temperature. You can be aware of average kinetic energy as it changes. I'm making a metaphor here, okay, but it's sort of analogous to taking pressure or temperature. You can see the overall waveform of the subconscious mind in real time. Underneath surface mental talk is subtler talk. Underneath that is subtler talk. Same deal. But you can watch the sort of changing contour of the system. Likewise with the body motion. So untangling is not just untangling the surface strands, it's untangling all the different strands until all the levels of inner visual processing are all sort of nicely over here, and all the levels of auditory thinking are over here, the emotional body is over here. At all levels, they're completely separated out. What happens at that point is that the emergent property of somethingness disappears. So, as I say, the traditional metaphor is the chariot thing. And where we left off last night is I said, I find that metaphor unconvincing. I know it refers to an experience that is absolutely true and very important. But to explain it in terms of sort of taking apart a chariot doesn't seem quite convincing. So let me give you something that I think is closer to what's going on, a closer metaphor. Now, you got to hear loud and clear, this is just a metaphor. I'm not saying this is the mechanism, but I think it's closer to the mechanism. We don't know the mechanism yet, scientifically. It'd be very interesting when we do, though. So here's something that's a little closer. Most of you have heard me say this a million times, but I'll say it again. So you have an old-fashioned TV set with a CRT, cathode ray tube, not the flat screen kind, but the kind, the old-fashioned kind. And there's like a test pattern, and there's a big white area. And I say there is no white on that screen. And you say, are you crazy? Just look, it's mostly white. And I say, are you sure? Let's take this magnifying glass. We agree that this magnifying glass does two things. It enlarges, but that's not what's important. It resolves. It takes things that for the naked eye fall together, but that are truly separate. And it allows you to actually see that separation. That's called the resolution power of the lens. So we know that it doesn't do anything else. It doesn't add or subtract to what's there. And it's really not the magnification we're interested in, it's the resolution, the clarity. And now I want you to look at that white with this magnifying glass, and as you get closer and closer and closer, what's going to happen? The impression white disappears as the reality little red, green, blue dots arises. So What happened to the white? Well, it was sort of never there to begin with. But it was actually, because if you don't look carefully, it's there. But if you look very, very carefully without changing anything at all, now it's not there. There's just red, green, and blue. Something like that occurs with inner see, hear, feel. When you're not looking carefully, it seems like there's a thing inside you called a self that you're imprisoned in these thoughts and emotions. It's not just that it's a thing, it's actually a prison that constrains your identity. But when you finally see it clearly enough, the somethingness goes away and the incarceration potential goes away. Or another way to put it is, it was never there to begin with. You just now can see that. An undesirable emergent property that's quite compelling vanishes simply through clarity. That's the core insight of early Buddhism. That's knowing yourself as a sensory system. So it may sound rather cold and not very relevant to things. So, I know myself as a sensory system. But actually, it's really, really big. Now, is that to know yourself at the deepest level? Well, no, I would say that there's a deeper level of knowing yourself, and we could actually extend the metaphor. Okay, red, green, and blue pixels. Once again, do understand, just a metaphor, just a way of thinking about things. Red, green, and blue pixels. What are they? Well, actually, they're radiant electromagnetic energy in the visual spectrum. That's how I perceive them. So if we think of, it's light. So from that perspective, it's just, they're different frequencies of the same thing. What's light? Well, that's a very interesting question from a physics point of view. But the metaphor is actually quite nice, because if you think of red, green, and blue as just different frequencies of the same thing, they're just part of this spectrum of radiant electromagnetic energy. Well, then there's a kind of unification there. So if you look more carefully at the actual substance of inner see, hear, feel, sure enough, it's sort of like vibrating space. And in fact, outer sight, sound, touch has the same quality. So it all becomes an integrated arabesque of energy. Vibrant, but sort of transparent. And then you come to realize that what's churning those vibrations, fomenting them, is that with each sensory and motor arising, there's a kind of effortless efflux and a simultaneous effortless influx that churns those vibrations into existence the way foam is born in the cleft of a hokusai wave. You know, there's that famous picture of Mount Fuji seen in the cleft of a wave, right, by the Japanese ukiyo-e artist Hokusai. So the expanding wave and a simultaneous contracting wave, there's a shear, and in that shear is born vibration. And that vibration, if it coagulates, creates the inner, the sense that there's a material world on the outside and a thing called self on the inside. But if you see it just as it is, there is just this effortless efflux and reflux. Like a fountain, a formless fountain of youth that's constantly gushing and gathering. Its center is wherever your attention goes. And its perimeter encompasses the whole self and scene. That is the dynamic side of the source. That is the deepest experience of the Dharmakaya in terms of its activity. However, that activity comes from and returns to an absolute rest that always pervades it. So it's a kind of eternal fountain of youth, a formless womb that moment by moment gives rise to self and world as it activates. But it arises from and returns to and is peppered by Shalom Bimromav, the peace of God's own heaven. There's this prayer, I remember it vividly from being a little boy. We in synagogue, Ose Shalom Bimromav, Hu Ya'ase Shalom, Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'ibru Amen. May the one that creates Asiyah, it's a creation. May the one that creates the peace of his own heaven give peace to you and all of Israel. Of course, for me, Israel doesn't mean a country. It's anybody who struggles for the Lord, Israel. It has a meaning in Hebrew. Struggle to experience El, the source. That's my interpretation of Israel anyway. Other people have other interpretations, I'm sure. But I have chosen that. It means Sangha, okay? Not a race, not a country. So sometimes I'll sing that. But that's what I mean. The shalom, the peace that comes with completeness, shalem, shlemut. That's what the Christian poet T.S. Eliot called the still point of the turning world, that I quoted from last night. At the still point of the turning world. Neither movement from nor towards. The restful part is when the movement in and out ceases. When the movement in and out starts, well, that's when the creative activity occurs. In the Jewish mystical tradition, that pulling apart of chesed and gvura, of contraction and expansion, they even have terms for it. It's just amazing. It's amazing. It's called tzimtzum. It creates a space. And then that space vibrates. So that's what happens for everyone in each moment of inner and outer see, hear, feel. And in each act of speech or body movement or thought. That's the primordial great perfection. To touch it is to know true love. So that's to understand it's yourself at the deepest possible level. It's if that becomes a moment-by-moment reality, then it's quite easy to have this sense of wanting to, of kinship with everyone, including people you don't like. It's, you know, you relate to flowers, but you can also relate to garbage cans. You can relate to your personal heroes, but you can also relate to people you fear or dislike or embarrass you. The trick is to realize that that's always first, before the reactivity can arise. There's nothing wrong with judgments. I have nothing wrong with judgment, okay? I definitely have opinions. I like certain politicians. I don't like other politicians, okay? I have my opinions. But I know for sure, before my opinion arises, when I first look or hear that person, the first thing that I experience is the source loving them into existence. That does not preclude me having opinions and judgments. It's just, it makes a very different context to things. Amor primero.